Now, Togo has suspended the broadcasts of French state-owned news outlets RFI and France 24 for 3 months, accusing them of biased and misleading reporting. Now, the decision comes after the channels covered recent protests and political changes in the country, including President Faure Gnassingbé's move into a powerful new role with no term limit, a move critics have called a constitutional coup. Both RFI and France 24 have rejected the claims, saying that their reporting follows strict journalistic standards and they are open to discussions with Togo's media regulator. Now, similar actions have been seen in other West African countries, raising concerns about press freedom and foreign influence. At what point does protecting national sovereignty begin to threaten the public's right to independent information, and who decides where that line is drawn? That is a big question. Now, today I'm joined by 3 gentlemen. We have Thamsanqua Zhou. He's an African Affairs Analyst in Davos, Switzerland. We also have Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow Africa Program in Chatham House, London, UK. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us at this time.
Thank you for having us.
Hello. Thank you for inviting us.
All right, so let me begin with Paul. Paul, you've heard the story. You know, Togo's broadcasting watchdog accused RFI and France 24 of relaying inaccurate, biased, and even contrary to established facts, you know, with no specifics provided. Let's have your thoughts on this.
I would say that actually the coverage that RFI and France 24 have provided of the political developments in Togo has been pretty balanced, fairly objective. It has not tilted away from the facts. I would say they're probably some of the most objective sources of news on developments in Togo. And what has happened in Togo over the last year or so is something that is very controversial, because already the former president, Faure Gnassingbé, who had been in power since 2005, he was the son of the previous president, Gnassingbé Eyadema, who had been in power since the 1960s. And there have been periodic moments in recent years of protest against the fact that this is this long family dynasty. And so last year, the government announced a constitutional change. So the role of president would become purely ceremonial, and instead, power would move to a new post of a strong prime minister who, as you said, would not be subject to any term limits. The presidency is a role where there are term limits. And Faure Gnassingbé moved across under this constitutional change to take up this new role as prime minister. And under the constitution, the prime minister can take up his post as many times as he likes. It's just dependent on the party having, he's the person chosen by the party that has the strongest position in parliament. And in Togo, the way electoral boundaries are drawn is very favorable to the governing party. So basically, it's pretty much assured of staying in power for the long term, and therefore installing its man as prime minister. And the coverage that RFI and France 24 have provided about this has been pretty straight. It's stuck to the facts. And my impression is that the big objection that the Togolese government has to these two media is that because they are a prominent French language media and the official language of Togo is French, they are the foreign media that Togolese people most often see. And so for a government which has pushed through this controversial political change, which has the practical effect of keeping Faure Gnassingbé in power for potentially a very long time, many more years, the government, the regime is resentful, concerned about the coverage that these two media have been providing. So that's my impression of what's happened. And the government would like to present it as a question of national sovereignty, but it isn't really a question of national sovereignty. The government has freely changed the constitution. Those foreign media have not interfered with that process. They've simply reported objectively on what is happening. But it is true that, of course, their reports include opposition comments as well as comments from the government. So that is good journalism, and it's balanced.
All right, so let's hear, from Thamsanqua. You did say that what's happened in Togo for the past year has actually been controversial. So, Thamsanqua, are you also of the opinion that this is not a question of national sovereignty?
Well, Dashan, let me begin where you where you posed a question. I think the question that you posed was, whose decision is it? Whose decision must it be for a country to decide what is within its own national interest and security? It is that country. So in this particular instance, let me take you a step back. So like Paul said, the family or the people that are in leadership, as in the second generation, that is there now, Gnassingbé taking over from, after the death of his father. These are people who have worked very closely with Paris, generation after generation. They understand. France 24 came when they were already in there. Radio France International has been there for a very long time. These are media institutions they have worked with for many years. These are media institutions they brought into the country. These are media institutions they almost always interact with, engage with editorially. They know what purpose they were actually serving. So when you see them falling out in the manner that they have, and when the regulator then begins to say, no, hang on a minute, we think that you guys, you are now deviating from the mandate to report in a way that will preserve the interest of the country. And I think we need to apply the same standards. If this was the Middle East and there's a country that is going through some political transition or changes or processes, and they say that they don't like certain media companies to report or to get accreditation, that would be accepted. If this was the UK, for instance, saying that, there is a Russian television or, channel, or maybe a Chinese, channel that, or an Iranian channel for that matter, in the UK, I'm specifically talking about those that lost their licenses to broadcast in the UK. The interpretation there that should have been given was the reports that these media organizations were given were not in the interest, in the national interest, security interest of the United Kingdom. So they lost their license. And I think Paul knows that. So I would like to see the African countries being given the same yardstick, the same barometer that we measure them with whenever something like this is actually happening. But I cannot emphasize it better than most that the administration in Lomé now is the same group of people that have been very, very close to Paris for a very long time, that understands the editorial purpose of these organizations. And if they think that these media organizations are no longer serving the national interest or are pursuing an agenda of regime change, then it becomes a question, is there any country anywhere that has a right to refuse to accredit any media organization, local or foreign? We can only take the cue from European countries.
Okay.
That in Ukraine, when there was a war, there are certain media organizations that were banned. In France, depending on what was happening, there are certain media organizations that are not allowed. In the UK, I have already mentioned one, media organization from Iran, another one from Russia, another one from China. These are things that we see all the time. The question is, should we treat African countries the same way in the way that they make their decisions, or should we honor their decision, or decide that well, why are they refusing to allow regime change? Every government, every politician goes into power to preserve that power.
Oh, okay, Thamsanqua. Now let's come back to Paul. Paul, the RFI, reaches some 33 million weekly listeners in Francophone Africa, and France 24 commands about 46.8 million viewers across the continent. Now, what impact will a 3-month blackout have on citizens' access to independent news?
Well, I think the first question is, will the blackout be effective? And we have to think it's only likely to be very partially effective because, after all, people across Togo, they have access to the internet. Unless the government is going to shut down the internet and try and control the internet, people will be able to watch it through the internet quite often. People have family abroad, both in other West African countries and in France and in other European countries. Also, some people will have virtual private networks to deliberately get around limits, not just for political reasons, but for other reasons as well. There isn't if you look at those other countries, in the Sahel, for example, where restrictions have been placed on foreign media, the main impact is it sometimes limits the ability of the journalists from those organizations to travel around and carry out interviews and research the situation, but it doesn't really seem to deprive people of access to information, people within the country of access to information very effectively about what's going on. And people, obviously, France 24 and RFI are two of the media that have particularly dense coverage of West Africa, and their journalists have a lot of contacts. So I suspect that quite a lot of the information will come out anyway. People, if you look at, as I say, the Sahel countries, those organizations have been able to carry on effective reporting, but they've done it sometimes without naming their journalists. They've done it in more discreet ways. They've drawn on other sources. So I'm not terribly sure that the government's approach will have that much effect. And it also suggests that the government is worried, because we've seen in several times in the last few years really serious big bouts of anti-government protest, very, very large protests indeed. And we've seen significant amounts of quite tough law and order repression of protests in some cases. So it suggests that there's quite a lot of underlying pressures and tensions. And I don't think controlling a few of the foreign media to some limiting a bit of their access is going to change that very much.
Okay. Now let's hear Thamsanqua's thoughts on this. You've asked the question, will this approach work considering the availability of the internet? So do you think that state bodies still, set the narrative, or will this simply push audiences online?
I don't want to believe that the suspension, I think it's a 3-month suspension that they were given. I don't want to believe that the suspension was given in a way that the government or those close to the regulatory authority think that the information will not be out. I think there's acceptance generally that social media has taken over from what we call regular media in a way. Wherever you look, whether you're looking at Europe or America or wherever, somebody who has an X account or social media account is more effective. The information or the videos that come from a demonstration or a protest are more effective. It doesn't matter who the source is. I would like to see this suspension or this move that has been done as a message to these organizations that you were brought to Lome by an administration, you were friends, you were serving an editorial role, and you have deviated from that. So I see this as a divorce or maybe a separation of sorts to say the administration is not happy with these organizations. And that has bigger implications beyond just seeing whether there's press freedom or no press freedom. It is about the relationship that Lome has with Paris. It is about all the other relations that are there between the French and the Togolese, probably extending to others in the region as well. So it is more about the relationship between the two capitals and the message that this is being given. Because it might move from the media organizations and then it goes to the embassies and the diplomats that are exchanged between the two countries, and it might escalate. So I think everyone will know that they can go next door and report from next door. They can have loads of sources within. It is never, I don't think, about whether there will be continued access to information. It is just about saying you won't have that diplomatic passport into the media, press rooms and stuff, which is what we see especially being done by President Trump in the US, because he will then designate others as fake media and others as not. And what that does is it just takes away the credibility that they have. They are no longer able to organize these government ministers for interviews or agencies for interviews. They are no longer able to be there when conferences are being done. So this, for me, is just a message rather than trying to stop them from reporting. They know that they will always report. There are too many sources. It's now social media that is ruling. It's no longer like in the old days where we were running around with papers to try and do some shorthand at a conference or something.
All right. Now, coming back to you, Paul, now that both outlets have actually insisted that they uphold strict journalistic standards and are willing to dialogue, what steps do you think can be taken to resolve this standoff without resorting to further suspensions?
Well, I suspect that it is a polite gesture to say we respect the institutions of the country, we will engage with the mediator, the media regulator, etc., etc. But I think fundamentally they will carry on reporting in the professional way that they do. And I certainly have had many dealings with both media organizations, and I would say that they're very rigorous. They're also very independent, and they actually carry a lot of free debate and criticism, often of French policy. They're not, you can't see them as a mouthpiece for or as an advocate of French policy in the region. They are constantly carrying debate programs where many people are often criticized, critical of French policy, scrutinize French policy. So in a curious way, actually being banned by a regime that is fundamentally quite authoritarian could actually bolster their credibility. If somebody says, oh, well, you just fit in with the establishment, you comply with control, they can say, well, look at the list of countries that we have been banned from now. So I think my fellow guest is right. It won't really inhibit their reporting. I suspect that in some ways, if the government sticks to its ban, in some ways, it could be a bit of the loser, because if government ministers refuse and spokesmen refuse to give the government's view to an international media, whether it's RFI, France 24, or whoever, and that media is still reporting what the opposition are saying, then the government is going to reduce its own message. These media are very widely watched and listened to, and it will actually potentially limit the government's ability to get a message across. And it's certainly true that once or twice Western countries have tried to impose some of these restrictions, and it's always very badly backfired, because then there's less coverage of the government's point of view. And I think that's particularly the case with a country such as Togo in West Africa, where there's a lot of information around, as has been pointed out, on the internet and in debate and so on. It may even have a domestic effect. If you look at the waves of protests there have been in Togo, all sorts of factors have suddenly triggered mass protest that's presented big challenges to the government. And if something like this, you never know, it could just be another little spark that triggers a further, actually adds more momentum to protest rather than the reverse.
Okay. Now, let's come back to you, Thamsanqua. Thamsanqua, earlier, we actually noted that the reason for the ban was because a protest was covered. And still talking about bans, there was a ban on public protests since 2022, which is still in effect following a deadly attack at Lomé's market. Yet we see demonstrations continue. Thamsanqua, do you think that a coverage of such unrest should be seen as destabilizing or essential?
I don't know. I mean, it depends on what it is that you're covering. It depends on the editorial line that you take. I want to level things here for the sake of your viewers, which is why I keep going to Western standards in these things. So if you go back to the United States of America, there are lots of protests. There've been protests even now in LA over the issues of immigration. The editorial line that the media will take will either be to say, there is a problem, we hear your voice, let's find out what the government can do about this. Or it could be one that says, well done for coming out. This is such an important thing that you are protesting about. This government must go. Now, you decide what editorial line you are taking. So the view that the regulatory authority in Lomé is taking is to say they are not happy with the editorial line that was taken. Not that the reports, it's not about the reports. It's about the content, the editorial line. Are you reporting in a way that will encourage others to, get involved in treason or insurrection or try to topple a government? Or you are reporting in a way that is raising those issues so that there can be a solution. Those two are two different things. And you will see that, especially in the Western media, there is discipline in the way that people report on these things. When there is a protest, there is discipline about how that protest is reported. And the problem that we have with African countries and the way things are looked at is always looked at as if the administration is oppressive and it is a regime. Once you start using words like that, you are not necessarily saying that about other countries that don't have elections at all, let alone, others whose elections might be disputed. So for me, it is more about how should these things be looked at? And we normally talk about these things at, international, union of journalists, platforms, to try, and number one, you want to protect the journalists so that they can do their work. Number two, you want these journalists to follow the laws within the jurisdictions where they are reporting. But more importantly, it is about public safety. It is about the public good. That is what journalism is all about. You don't want to do a report that then causes a genocide or a civil war or, causes a government to be toppled and everything. Because you have seen this in the past. The role of the media, every time when there's a genocide, you might find that the media had a role. And that role probably encouraged the other people to do that, or stop the other people from stopping what was about to happen. So for me, it is a bigger question, more philosophical, journalistic question than just assuming that, oh, this is an administration that doesn't like, the font that, is used for this organization and maybe banning them. You have to also remember, which is why I was saying to you, Darshan, these administrations have been working with these media organizations from Paris for a long time. They know who funds them. Okay. They know their purpose. They know why they report in the manner they do.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for that. What we'll do is we'll take a quick break, gentlemen. When we come back, we'll definitely continue this conversation. Do stay with us. Welcome back, and thank you for staying. You're still watching the conversation, and today we're still discussing Togo's suspension of broadcast French-owned or French state-owned news outlets, that's RFI and France 24, for 3 months after accusing them of biased and misleading reports. And we still have Thamsanqua and Paul with us here. Thank you so much for staying with us, gentlemen. Now, coming back to you, Paul. Now, I read a report that in April, Togo expelled a French freelance reporter, deported him within 5 days. How does this pattern of expulsion and bans compare with the broader press freedom crackdown in the region? I'm asking exactly how serious is the threat to press freedom in Togo?
Well, I think we have to remember the broad West African context, that back in 2001, I think it was, all the member countries of ECOWAS, the regional bloc, the Economic Community of West African States, signed up to a code on good governance and democracy, which had various human rights and freedom of speech provisions in it. And Togo was among those countries. Obviously, now 3 countries have left ECOWAS, so they have formally given up their commitment, if you like, to those principles. The 3 Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and we've seen that the people in those countries, there is no longer a democratic space, and they have decided to have military government. The military, who are already in power, have decided to prolong their rule for another 5 years, and the freedom of political action and debate has been suspended or abolished, basically, in those countries. In Mali, for example, a few days ago, political parties were all officially dissolved and banned. And in the other countries, you have a mixed picture. So there are very few countries where the principles of free speech and free debate are completely honored, but it varies from one to another. So we have some countries with very strong, lively media traditions, like Senegal, like Nigeria, like Ghana, like Cote d'Ivoire, where there is a lot of information out there and there's a lot of debate. Occasionally, some individual journalists or media outlets have come under some pressure, but there's basically a wide degree of freedom. And then you have some countries, such as Benin, such as Togo, where restrictions have become tighter over, either in the case of Togo, fairly tight all along, or in the case of Benin, they've become tighter over recent years. And so there's less media freedom. So what Togo, I suppose you could say, is now reinforcing its position in the camp of those countries that impose tighter restrictions on freedom, even though formally it still subscribes to that 2001 protocol about democracy and the freedoms that go with it.
All right. Thamsanqua, now Paul did say earlier, he talked about how this isn't an isolated incident, and Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have all taken aim at French media recently, and that's in addition, or some would actually link it to the French troops, leaving the country due to the military-led leaders now. Now, do you think that this reflects a broader geopolitical rift between Francophone Africa and France?
It definitely does. And I think you have to add the election cycle, I should say, even countries like Senegal, because the electoral result in Senegal is not one that was favoring Paris. So you have to look at the trend and say there's probably, or is evidently, one that is working against the French and the French interest in the region. Let's see what happens in Côte d'Ivoire, but by and large, a majority of people, especially the young people, want to move away from the influence that Paris has in the Francophone Africa and the region in general. But also, I would like to say, as a journalist, it's always said when one is deported, one is banned, or not able to do their work, it's not a good thing. But I would also want to emphasize that it is also important as journalists that we follow the rules, the regulations in the countries where we report, so that we don't put the public or colleagues or ourselves in danger. But I also want to go further and say I disagree in a big way with the Western imposed democracy is the panacea of everything, because since independence, a lot of African countries have been democratic, holding elections, but poverty has become worse, the economies have become worse, the countries have become worse. When you look at the countries that are actually doing well, there are those countries who do not have democracy, like China, like the Middle East. Those are countries that have a totally different political system. So I would want to see Africans being allowed to come up with their own system of governance that suits their own scenario and situations. The UK, for instance, is a monarch. And nobody says, oh, no, you should not be a monarch. They're doing well within that system. And there's absolutely no problem. There are no term limits for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister of the UK can stay there for 100 years if they want to, if people are still voting for them. So for me, I would like to see that. I would like to see Africa having whatever form of governance that they want, but guaranteeing press freedom, freedom of expression, human rights. These things are crucial. The press must be able to do its job. Journalists must be able to work unhindered. You should not be controlled. You should not be censored. But at the end of the day, I also disagree with this philosophical idea that if you bring Western democracy and try to impose it on African countries, then they'll become better. Because
still in line with that, Thamsanqua, I want to ask this question before I pass the question to Paul. Now, what then? You just spoke in line with what you've said. What can you say about the claim that foreign outlets serve as proxies in an information war, as suggested by some European policymakers?
It depends on who funds them. Every media organization serves the purpose or the direction of the one that funds them. There are certain people, organizations, or countries that fund media organizations but don't demand any editorial control. But there are others who say they are funding you in order for you to advance their interests. And we saw that with the Americans. The Americans closed down funding of a lot of media organizations, but we know that those media organizations were expected to follow a certain editorial line. So I think it's unfair to just paint everyone with the same brush. There are certain people that fund media organizations and don't care what editorial line, what the stories they report on, what the journalists do. They are free to do what they want. But also we know there are certain countries that fund these media organizations for them to advance the interests of the country that is funding. Because if Nigeria was putting taxpayers' money into a media organization and sending that media organization out to other countries, you would expect that the purpose of that media organization is either soft power in those countries, or it is actually to spread the good message, create, brand Nigeria, brand Lagos, so that people can look favorably at that country. It's the same thing whether you're talking about cinema, we are talking about other things, the storyline that you might have in Hollywood or Bollywood or elsewhere. It is all about what image, what brand do you want to promote. So the funder determines. Some funders don't care, but some funders want to editorially control everything.
All right, Paul, do you agree that those who fund that particular media determines what goes out, and do you think that these international news organizations should adapt to the country's standards, when reporting, especially on politically charged events?
I don't really agree with that. I think the key to, and I'm also a journalist myself. I think that the key to credible journalism that produces reporting that people can actually rely on, that is worth listening to or following, the key to that is professional competence and self-discipline and commitment to journalistic standards and so on. And yes, there are some cases where media outlets are promoting a particular government line and are promoting a particular view of the world or a particular interpretation of stories very vigorously. But actually, I think there are a significant number of media outlets that aren't promoting a particular government line, that are genuinely independent, even though they are financed usually with quite some distance between the political government and the journalism outlet. The BBC, for example, doesn't promote the policies of the British government. In fact, as someone living in London, I can tell you that the BBC often has very, very extensive coverage that is higher, it covers news objectively, and that includes covering a lot of those people who criticize the British government. And as I mentioned before, France 24 very often has extensive coverage of views that are very, very critical of the French government. So I don't think that ownership directly links. I think there's also a wider point that democracy in Francophone West Africa, and in fact in most of West Africa, is not imposed by the West. At independence, most of the countries in the region were set up, they were, as it were, freed into independence, given a parliamentary multi-party political system to start off with. But most of them later, with only one or two exceptions like Senegal, most of them later suffered military coups and changes of government over a period of, and went through long periods of authoritarian rule. And in many of the Francophone countries, democracy then came back in the early 1990s, usually through mass people power protests organized by local people, nothing to do with outside interference, nothing to do with the French or the Europeans or the Americans or anybody else. Big protests, strikes, big demonstrations, and sometimes people paid a price in lives, as in Mali, where the army at the time shot school children who were protesting to demand in this protest campaign. And then as the protests forced the authoritarian governments to give way, in many countries, they then organized national conferences, national debates to decide on a new political system. And in most cases, in those debates, the decision that was reached was to set up elected political institutions with multi-party political systems. So democracy, it's wrong to say that democracy is some sort of Western concept that was imposed on Africa, certainly in West Africa from outside. And if you look at opinion polling, West Africans very strongly support, they want democracy. They have all sorts of criticisms of the individual politicians or the way that democracy functions, or the distortions or corruption or patronage and various pressures that undermine its effectiveness. But on the whole, actual public support for the concept of elected democracy in a multi-party system remains very strong. And a lot of the waves of protests that have taken place in Togo over recent years, they have mostly, in 2017, people were protesting, demanding in the name of democratic rights. Then again in 2020, during the presidential election, there were waves of protests around that. The protests have usually in Togo been demands for a system that is a more real democracy rather than the democracy that is rather distorted because of the way that it's been organized at present, for example, with the boundaries of voting districts designed to make it much easier for the government to win than the opposition. So I think democracy has strong West African roots, and that is what, not always, but that is often what people are seeking to push for.
Okay. Now we're about winding down, this topic. Let's have your final thoughts, Thamsanqua, and also if you could actually, respond to the fact that the HAC, that's the regulatory body, media regulatory body, gave no detailed list of specific offences for these two media outlets. So for transparency's sake, do you think that regulators should be required to cite precise examples when accusing journalists or even media houses of bias?
Yeah, starting there, I think they need to be transparent in terms of why they have suspended. It's not a ban, it's a suspension, I think 3-month suspension. And then they're going to review after that time. It's very important that we get to know why. And also it's important for these organizations to know what it is, editorial, the content that got them into trouble, so that they know what to avoid. It's also important for other media organizations and freelance journalists and others that are operating on the ground to know the things to avoid, because they wouldn't want that to happen to them. But let me, in closing, let me just agree with Paul, but also probably raise a point of information. When people demonstrate in London every Saturday, but those that are demonstrating, even if there are thousands of them, they are not necessarily the reflection of the 60 or 70 million people in Britain. France, you go to Bastille, there are people that are demonstrating almost every weekend. But those demonstrations, big as they might be, they are not the reflection of the entire population of France. So even if we see demonstrations or protests in West Africa or in Lome in this case, it doesn't mean that 500 people that are demonstrating, or 1,000 people or 10,000 people are a reflection of the entire mood of the country. So I speak from having reported for over 30 years on the ground within the African continent to know that the majority of the African people actually prefer the old governance system where they had kingdoms and they have chiefs and they had other people that they respect within their areas. And they will tell you that the Western democracy aspect, it costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of lives every 4 or 5 years whenever the electoral cycle is. But more importantly, these were imposed by the international institutions like the UN, where the countries that had a different form of governance, whether it was military or kingdom in the case of Eswatini, were told that they will never be allowed to be full participants of UN agency organizations or get loans from the World Bank or be treated as equals unless they had multi-party democracy in the manner that it manifests in the West. Of course, we know that is never applied to Saudi Arabia, UAE, or Qatar, or Bahrain, or China, or any of those other countries. But this is what the expect. Even these countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Gabon, the expectation was they need to transition from whatever they have now to Western-style multi-party democracy, for sanctions to be lifted, for them to be incorporated into what is called the community of nations. So it's only that sometimes it's difficult to know what happens on the ground. But I will tell you for certain that the majority of the African people are not happy with this style of democracy where every election cycle, so many people are killed because of political violence, but nothing tends to change afterwards. But the demand...
all right, Thamsanq, sorry, we just have 2 minutes left, so would love to hear Paul's final thoughts as well. Please go ahead.
Just a couple of quick points, which I think are worth bearing in mind. Look, last December, there was an election in Ghana. The government changed, people voted. There's no evidence to suggest that there was a lot of outside interference. That seemed to be a pretty popular process. And certainly in Senegal, where I spent a lot of time over the last couple of years, there was a very, very strong grassroots, popular, very widespread demand for people wanted to choose their government through the ballot box. They did not, the protests were against what was perceived as interference in that process by the former government, the incumbent government at the time. And people in those countries, you know, the first black Senegalese member was elected to the French Parliament in 1914. People have a deeply ingrained culture of thinking that politics is important, and not every. I mean, I think one must be very careful of generalizing, but I think those two examples are just show that there is a significant support for democratic culture in Western Africa. And when it comes to media, equally people want to be able to have a choice of media that they can hear from, watch, and obviously sometimes read, to see different views expressed, to see arguments and debates expressed, and to be able to then make their own decisions about how they want their countries to move forward from there. And so I think what we're seeing in Togo is it's one of the countries that has less freedom than some of those others in Western Africa. It's also
all right, Paul. So sorry to cut you off there, but we have to wrap up now. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thamsanqua Zhou, African Affairs Analyst in Davos, Switzerland, and Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow, Africa Program, Chatham House, London, UK. We appreciate you for your time.